Hi all, welcome to a Sitnos special episode, Ghostly Tales from South Stack, as inspired by my recent road trip along the Welsh coast. Now, before we start, just a quick disclaimer, the quality of editing in this special will be non-existent. Rox is having a well-earned break whilst I attempt to sing for my supper. Since I cannot edit and have no interest in learning how to do so before I complete my masters, please enjoy this PowerPoint presentation. Originally I was going to use some horrendous animation transitions and word art, but the more I was researching into this, the heavier the subject matter got, and therefore I did not think it was appropriate to use that type of levity. May this whole experience serve as the negative print to Rox's positive and highlight her many skills and contributions. I know I appreciate them every time I look at a video and think, yeah, I couldn't have done that. Anyway, let's get into this. Welcome to Stories from South Stack, and more specifically, The Grey Lady of South Stack and the Sad Tale of Jack Jones. So what are grey ladies? Much like the ladies in white, a grey lady is a ghost whose death is linked to love and grief, typically through a violent death or by dying from grief over the loss of love. Those who have seen season 1 will know that this is not overly dissimilar to the ladies in white. A lady in white is usually associated with tragic deaths, the loss of children or betrayal, and typically have motives of justice, whereas a grey lady is said to be a benevolent spirit, bound to the mortal coil by grief. There are cases of grey ladies popping up all over the UK. Notable examples of such include the Grey Lady of Dudley Castle, where Dorothy Beaumont is said to be wandering the castle after her daughter died during childbirth and her herself dying of complications soon after. Her request of being buried beside her daughter and that her husband attend the funeral were not met, so she cannot rest. The Grey Lady of Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk involved tales of a medieval nun whose death is either linked to the death of the Duke of Gloucester or for involvement with a monk at the abbey. The sources aren't clear, but either way, she has apparently been spotted at the ruins of the abbey as well as St Saviour's Hospital and elsewhere in the area. But as interesting as those tales are, let's turn our thoughts back to Wales and think instead of the stories associated with South Stack Lighthouse and of the Grey Lady. So let's consider the history of South Stack Lighthouse for a moment. Built in 1809, South Stack Lighthouse and the surrounding area has housed many families of the keepers and the lighthouse keepers, of course, during its operation. However, during the 1930s, families stopped being permitted to live on South Stack. This is likely due to concerns over child welfare. From speaking to volunteers at the lighthouse, there were multiple instances of children dying from accidents or drownings in a record. Looking at the picture from my Polaroid, you can see how that would really be the case. There are approximately 400 steps down to the lighthouse, and then inside the lighthouse there are again many more steps. It's not an easy ascent to get back up once you've climbed down and gone around the lighthouse, but overall, it's well worth it. It's incredible to go over to South Stack and to be in that lighthouse. And the volunteers had so much information to share. So there are two main ghost stories associated with South Stack. The primary story is that of Jack Jones, and the other more local legend story is that of the Grey Lady. Interestingly, whilst I was at the lighthouse, I think I missed a chunk of the initial talk due to just timings, so I didn't hear too much about Jack Jones. I'd only really heard of the Grey Lady. To understand the ghost stories of South Stack Lighthouse, we must first be aware of the Royal Charter Storm. On the 25th of October in 1859, the storm of the century happened, or at least the storm of the century for the Irish Sea. During this storm, over 200 vessels were wrecked or beached, with an estimated life loss being around 800. Amongst this storm, the Royal Charter steam clipper sank merely yards from receiving help and led to the loss of 500 passengers and crew. The winds that day were said to be over 100 miles per hour. Elsewhere in the country, such as Devon and Cornwall, extensive structural damage was observed along the coasts, and the storm was moving north and hit Anglesey around 8 p.m. To put into perspective about how severe the storm was, the average Anglesey wind speeds are typically between 10 and 15 miles per hour. In October, it's usually 14 miles per hour. That's a pretty big contrast when you compare 14 miles per hour to 100 miles per hour winds observed during storm. One of the volunteers told me, and indeed showed me, a photo of storm conditions being so harsh that the waves themselves crash over the lighthouse. And I don't even think that was, well, obviously it wouldn't have been taken from the Royal Charter storm. So we've had smaller storms in recent years where we've been able to document the waves crashing over the lighthouse. I can only imagine what the condition of the sea was during the Royal Charter storm. So with an understanding of the severity of the Royal Charter storm, let's look at the story of Jack Jones. Assistant lighthouse keeper Jack Jones was outside of the lighthouse during the Royal Charter storm. Whilst trying to get back to the lighthouse, he was struck in the head by a falling rock. Due to the volume of the storm, the winds, everything, no one was able to hear his calls for help, and he was left outside until the morning. He later succumbed to his injuries sustained during the ordeal of that night. The story is that his spirit is still on South Stack, and some nights he can be heard banging on the windows and doors, as well as footprints from certain reports. This is factual, but obviously not the ghostly elements, but what had happened to Jack Jones. So even though I don't believe in ghosts, I especially don't like the idea of someone being harmed so physically and spiritually from that ordeal that they are forever trying to right what went wrong and get back into the lighthouse. I think that wind causing banging on, or rattling windows and doors is a far more reasonable explanation for the ghostly happenings, especially in the coastal area. But I think that when something devastating happens, especially something so unpredictable, it can cause these community scars where people are grieving and looking for signs or just feel the pain and the absence so keenly that they find patterns that aren't there, or almost develop an aversion for the location where something happened, giving that location a perception of bad energy. Rox isn't here to argue with me on this, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but my personal belief in ghosts aside, I think that my theory is much kinder to Jack Jones, because I would dread to think of someone being so tormented by that kind of experience. So let's look at the Grey Lady of Southstack. Interestingly, there is very sparse information on the Grey Lady of Southstack. Any inklings of ghost stories were more of a throwaway comment from volunteers or the odd line referenced somewhere in a article. But what I could find was that the Grey Lady is said to be found wandering the lighthouse paths, stairs and cliffs, generally just the surrounding area, and is more likely to be observed during foggy weather. She doesn't have a fixed origin story or an original name, and is kind of more of a secondary support ghost when the tales focus primarily on Jack Jones. The origins that I have found seem to suggest that perhaps she was someone who passed away during the Royal Charter storm, or even the widower of someone who had passed away during the Royal Charter storm. Although there has very little information on her, she has apparently been observed. I will say that seeing a grey lady in fog isn't that far-fetched. When you look at something long enough, you tend to see a pattern, perhaps, that isn't there. It's, after all, a lot safer to think that you have seen something in the shadows than it is to miss something that could have been in the shadows. Evolutionary instincts are very cool like that. I think I can say with confidence that nearly everyone has experienced something like this. Personally, I know that I do. For example, if I'm walking around my house in the dark with the lights off, sometimes I see shapes moving around my peripherals, and then if I double take, there is nothing there when my eyes refocus. Again, it's more of a leftover evolutionary response to ensuring safety and prevent yourself from being predated. So I don't really like leaving things on a depressing note, and I've actually threatened rocks with horrible animation and so far not delivered. So let's talk about super cool lighthouse stuff. So first of all, the image on the right hand side is a Fresnel lens. Now this is an incredible optical design created by French physicist Augustin Jean Fresnel in the 1820s. So what's super cool about these is that they are constructed from a series of concentric rings, with each ring functioning like a prism. The grooves are able to bend and collect scattered light and focus it into a strong beam through the process of refracting and reflection. The lens used in Southstack can capture and concentrate approximately 80% of the light produced. This lens was introduced in 1873. I think that the original light source was from paraffin fuel. However, modernisation eventually made this into electric light. So further upgrades were made in 1905, where the rotating mechanism was upgraded to a trough of mercury, and I think it's between 1 and 2 tons of mercury up there. This is really, really cool, and you might be thinking, how does having a mercury trough do anything? But because mercury is so dense, the lens is able to kind of float on top of it, enabling that rotation movement, and the South Stack Lighthouse gives a flash of light every 10 seconds. Again, the whole thing's really cool, but what is additionally very, very cool is that the number of flashes within a set time period actually tells the sailor where along the coast they are. And this is incredibly useful from a navigational point of view, where let's say it's night, it's dark, you can't really see any standard landscapes along the coast. You can time the flashes of light to figure out where you are along the UK coast. So I'm going to cut myself off there before I get too into talking about this. I just think that the lenses are incredibly beautiful, and the invention of the Fresnel lens has actually been credited as saving countless lives by the Maritime Society. So yeah, that's my kind of special episode on South Stack Lighthouse. Thank you for listening to me go on about it. I know it's not as long as standard episodes, but I don't really have rocks to argue with, which kind of dampens how into random side conversations we can go and how much ranting I can do. But we are going to be picking up with recording season 3 soon, so hopefully I'm going to be a lot less rusty in terms of my recording, and then of course you will have actual proper editing and not this terrible PowerPoint presentation. But I hope it hasn't been too horrendous for you all to experience. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.